Rhys Paxton had not planned on noticing anything. He had planned on getting Nadia settled into seat 14F before the overhead bins filled up, then finding somewhere quiet in his own head for the 2-hour flight to Vancouver. That was the whole plan. Small, manageable, nothing that required expertise or the kind of attention he had spent 11 years learning how to apply. He was lifting Nadia's backpack into the overhead when his eyes tracked the length of the overwing emergency exit door the way they always did. Not anxiously, not with any particular intention, just the way a man who spent over a decade studying door assembly tolerances tracks things without choosing to. It was an old reflex. It had never quite learned how to stop. The gap was small, nearly nothing. A thin inconsistency along the lower port edge of the exit door's inner seal, where the compression gasket met the frame. To an untrained eye, it wouldn't have registered as anything at all. To Rhys, it registered as the specific kind of small thing that compounds. He had written 42 pages about exactly this. He told Nadia to take her seat. She was 10 years old and had the focused, cheerful efficiency of a child who had absorbed her father's careful attention to the world as ambient weather for most of her life. Without ever quite understanding what he was paying attention to, she climbed past him, pressed her nose to the window, and began narrating the ground crew's movements below, because that was who Nadia was. Rhys crouched in the aisle and looked at the seal again. The gap was consistent, not a trick of light or an angle problem. A door seal that had been reseated improperly after its last maintenance cycle. The lower gasket compressed along the forward edge and released along the aft, which meant at ground-level pressure differential, the gap was a hairline. At cruising altitude, with the full pressure differential between cabin interior and open atmosphere, that hairline would become something else. He had seen this exact failure mode in component testing. He had documented the conditions under which it occurred, the maintenance shortcuts that produced it, and the altitude threshold at which it stopped being theoretical. He stood up and looked for a flight attendant. Shannon Weld was moving through the aisle with the particular efficiency of someone running 4 minutes behind a departure schedule and not intending to let that number grow. She had the pleasant, practiced expression of a person who had learned to make the word fine sound like the end of a sentence rather than the beginning of a conversation. When Rhys caught her eye and raised a hand, not urgently, just clearly, she pivoted toward him with the kind of professional attentiveness that had its limits built into it. He told her about the seal. He did it without drama, without the trembling qualifications of a man who wasn't sure of himself. He pointed to the lower port edge of the exit door frame and described what he was seeing in terms as precise as he could make them without a measuring instrument. The gasket compression asymmetry, the likely maintenance cycle explanation, the pressure differential implications at altitude. Shannon looked where he pointed. She looked for approximately 3 seconds. She told him the aircraft had been fully inspected before boarding and that all safety systems had been cleared for departure. She said it in a tone designed to be reassuring, and which instead landed as conclusive. Rhys said he understood that. He said a visual inspection at ground level under standard pre-boarding protocol was not designed to catch this particular failure mode, because the failure mode was pressure dependent, and they were not yet under altitude pressure. He asked her to please pass the observation to the captain. Shannon Weld was not a negligent person. She had 6 years with the carrier and took her responsibilities seriously. She had also, in those 6 years, developed a working instinct for the specific kind of passenger who arrived at the gate with a personal theory about aircraft safety, usually wearing the particular combination of certainty and anxiety that indicated too many hours spent reading forums rather than too many hours spent in a maintenance bay. The man in seat 14E fit a shape she recognized: flannel-lined jacket, work-worn hands, a child pressing her face against the window. She told him, in a voice that carried clearly to the 3 rows on either side, that the exit doors were inspected by certified aviation maintenance engineers, and that if he was feeling anxious about flying, the crew could provide resources. She said resources, like anxiety was something that came in pamphlet form. The man in 15C, mid-40s, pressed shirt, the impatient posture of someone whose schedule was not accustomed to being held, exhaled in a way that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. A woman 2 rows forward turned briefly to look at Rhys, with the mild curiosity of someone watching a minor incident resolve itself without requiring their involvement. Nadia had been watching her father. With the side of her face, she reserved for paying serious attention to things while pretending to look out the window. She was 10. She understood that something had just happened to him in public. She understood it the way children understand social weather before they have language for it. Not through the words, but through the shift in how the air felt. Her father's hands were still. His face hadn't changed. He had the look he got when he was deciding something slowly. He said to Shannon, without raising his voice, that he did not require her to agree with him. He required her to relay the observation to the captain, because the captain held the authority to make that call, and a flight attendant relaying a passenger's concern was not an endorsement of that concern. It was a transmission of information. He said the distinction mattered. Shannon's expression settled into something with less warmth in it. The man in 15C said audibly that some people needed to let the professionals do their jobs. Shannon told Rhys that if he continued, she would have to consider asking him to deplane. She said it with the measured calm of someone who meant it to function as the end of the conversation. Rhys looked at Nadia. She was looking at her hands. Her chin had dropped the way it did when she was holding something in. He stood slowly. He said he would leave the aircraft if Shannon decided that was appropriate. He said the door seal needed to be assessed before departure. He said those were the only 2 things he had to say, and he had said them both. Shannon reached for the interphone handset with the manner of someone resolving a situation efficiently. In the cockpit, First Officer Brody Oakes was midway through a pre-departure checklist item when the interphone chirped. He listened to Shannon's message. A passenger in 14E, concerns about an overwing exit seal, requesting the situation be closed, and reached for the response toggle. Captain Vincent Laurier was looking at the fuel load confirmation on his tablet. He put a hand out, not urgently but definitively, and asked Shannon to read him the name on the boarding manifest. Seat 14E. There was a brief pause on the line. Shannon read it. Rhys Paxton. Brody watched his captain set the tablet down in the careful, deliberate way of a man making space to think clearly. Vincent said they were holding at the gate. He said it quietly, without explanation, and reached for his jacket. He had first encountered the name Rhys Paxton 6 years ago in a technical document that a contact at the Canadian Aviation Safety Board had forwarded to him with a single line attached. You should read this before it disappears. The document was titled Overwing Exit Door Seal Failure Modes Under Repeated Pressurization Cycling. A maintenance analysis, 42 pages, authored by a structural maintenance engineer at a Calgary MRO facility called Continental Aerotech. The analysis described a specific combination of improper gasket reseating technique and accelerated maintenance intervals that produced seal compression asymmetry, invisible to visual inspection at ground level and potentially critical at altitude pressure differential. It included photographic evidence from component testing, failure scenario modeling, and a clear recommended correction to the relevant service bulletin's implementation language. Continental Aerotech had described the document internally as speculative analysis produced outside the bounds of the author's authorized scope. The author had been edged out of the company 8 months after submitting it. Vincent had used that document in 4 crew safety seminars. He had cited it in a formal submission to the carrier's safety committee the previous year. He had never expected to hear the name on a boarding manifest. He walked out of the cockpit. The effect on the cabin was immediate, not loud, but total, a stiffening, a recalibration of what was happening. Passengers do not often see a captain in full uniform walking purposefully down the center aisle during a ground hold, and when it happens, the cabin pays attention in a way it does not pay attention to most things. Vincent walked to row 14. The man sitting there was not what the name had conjured. The Rhys Paxton of the technical document had existed in Vincent's mind as an abstraction, rigorous, institutional, credentialed. The man in seat 14E was wearing a flannel-lined jacket with a frayed cuff, holding a thermos with a small Flames logo on the side, sitting beside a child who was watching him with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. Vincent asked him directly, no preamble, no softening, whether he was the Rhys Paxton who had written the overwing seal analysis for Continental Aerotech out of Calgary. The cabin went quiet. Shannon Weld, standing at the front of the aisle, did not move. Rhys said yes. He said it the way a person confirms something they stopped expecting to be asked about. Not with relief, not with performance. With the flat honesty of a fact that had been true for a long time, regardless of whether anyone had thought to ask. Vincent said, "Show me." Rhys stood. He pointed to the lower port edge of the exit door frame. He described the asymmetric compression pattern. He traced the line of the gasket with a finger that stopped short of touching the seal itself, explained the maintenance cycle scenario most likely to produce it, described the pressure differential threshold at which the gap would exceed safe tolerances. He said it quietly, in the same register he might use to describe a mechanical problem to a colleague standing beside him in a service bay. He did not perform it. He simply said what he saw. Vincent looked at the seal for 10 seconds. Then he turned and called for the ground maintenance crew. Brody Oakes, watching from the cockpit doorway, uncrossed his arms. Nadia had been watching all of this from approximately 30 centimeters from her father's shoulder. She was old enough to understand that something significant was happening. She was young enough to understand it, primarily through the change in how the adults around her were behaving. A few minutes ago, they had been impatient or quietly amused or elaborately indifferent to her father. Now the captain of the aircraft was standing in the aisle asking her father to explain something, and the tone in which he was asking was the tone Nadia associated with adults asking other adults questions because they genuinely needed the answers. She didn't know what gasket compression asymmetry meant. She didn't know what pressure differential threshold meant. She knew the difference between the way people looked at her father when he picked her up from school in his truck, the one with the peeling decal on the tailgate, and the way they were looking at him now. The gap between those two things was large enough that she felt it in her chest, though she didn't yet have a word for exactly what it was. Her father put a hand briefly on her shoulder, the same way he always did when he was telling her, without saying it, that things were in hand. Then he turned his attention back to the door. What Rhys Paxton had been, before he became a man in a flannel jacket in economy, was not something he explained to people, because the true version required more context than most conversations allowed, and the simplified version made him sound like either a martyr or a cautionary tale, depending on how the listener felt about institutions. He had spent 11 years as an aircraft maintenance engineer at Continental Aerotech, working in the Structural Integrity Division. The work was meticulous and mattered enormously, and was almost entirely invisible to the people whose lives it protected. He was skilled at it in a way that went beyond procedure. He had the pattern recognition of someone who read mechanical systems the way other people read faces, seeing the small signals before they were legible to everyone else. He had written the seal analysis after 14 months of documentation. He had identified a failure mode occurring across aircraft maintained by Continental, using a service bulletin implementation that defaulted to speed over thoroughness. He had tried twice through internal channels to have the issue escalated. The first attempt produced a review committee. The second produced a different review committee that reached a different conclusion. He submitted the analysis to a CASB contact and to the Aviation Safety Registry. 3 weeks later, a hangar pressurization test at a contracted facility produced a seal failure consistent with his documented scenario. Nobody was hurt. The aircraft was not in service. Continental's legal team described the event as isolated and attributed to technician error. They described Rhys's analysis as outside his authorized scope. He was offered a settlement. He declined it. He left the company 8 months later in a restructuring that produced no paper trail connecting his departure to the analysis. His wife, Frances, had watched the contraction of their finances and his increasing withdrawal into the fight for 2 years. When she got the diagnosis, an aggressive form of lymphoma that moved faster than any of the timelines the oncologists offered, she spent the last 14 months of her life making sure that Nadia would be all right without her, and making sure that Rhys understood that the way he saw the world, the careful noticing, the refusal to round down on something that mattered, was not a liability. It was the thing she had loved most about him. She died on a Tuesday in March, when the snow was still on the ground in Calgary, and Nadia was 7, and Rhys was 39, and none of the numbers added up to anything that felt like enough. He had Nadia. He found work as a diesel mechanic at a mining equipment company in Airdrie, because the mechanical intuition that had made him valuable in aerospace didn't disappear just because aerospace had made him unwelcome. He was good at the work. It was not the work he had built himself for. He had not talked about the SEAL analysis in years. He had, with genuine effort, stopped being angry about it. He had not stopped seeing what he saw. The maintenance crew arrived at Gate 22 with the practiced calm of professionals whose entire work culture was built around not appearing alarmed. There were 2 of them. A senior AME named Terry Hobbs, who had been with the carrier for 16 years, and a younger technician named Priya, working under Terry's certification, who had the focused manner of someone still building the internal library that experience eventually makes automatic. Terry looked at the seal and said, in the specific tone of a man preparing to close a question, that it appeared to be within normal tolerances for a door seal of this age and cycle count. Vincent told him to look specifically at the lower port edge compression pattern. He told him to compare the aft and forward sections. Terry looked again. He looked for longer. He asked Priya to hand him the bore light. What the bore light found was not catastrophic in isolation. It was not something that would have failed a standard line inspection, because the standard line inspection was not designed for this failure mode. What it confirmed was the asymmetric compression pattern. The forward section of the gasket seated correctly, the aft section showing the characteristic bunching of a gasket installed under slightly off-axis pressure, which, over multiple pressurization cycles, had produced the hairline gap along the lower edge. Terry took 4 photographs. He and Priya conferred in low voices. Then Terry turned to Captain Laurier and said the aircraft should not depart until a comprehensive SEAL assessment was completed, and depending on what that found, potentially until a component replacement could be scheduled. He pulled up the component's maintenance record on his tablet. The service bulletin associated with the SEAL assembly had been addressed, but the implementation had defaulted to the standard inspection interval rather than the enhanced one the bulletin had implied, though not explicitly mandated. 3 years of standard inspections had passed over something the enhanced protocol was designed to catch. Quinn Sherwood, the regional station operations director for the carrier, arrived at Gate 22 having already fielded 2 calls about the delayed departure. She was prepared to be professionally sympathetic and operationally decisive. She was not prepared for the maintenance conversation she walked into, and she was less prepared for the name that surfaced in Terry's account of how the conditioned had been identified. Quinn had been in airline operations for 14 years. Early in her career, during a carrier safety audit that she had participated in, she had come across a technical reference document that had informed one of the audit's key findings. The document was credited in a footnote. She had never read it in full. She remembered the name of the author, the way you remember names of people who were important in a room you never quite entered. She stood at gate 22 and experienced the particular, disorienting sensation of a footnote becoming a person, and that person being the man in the worn jacket whom the flight attendant had told to let the professionals handle it. The conversation that followed was the kind that organizations have when a near miss reveals not an incident, but a pattern. Patterns are more expensive and more threatening than incidents, because they imply that the incident was always nearby, waiting only for the variables to align. The carrier had not been negligent in any intentional sense. No one had made a decision to let something dangerous go unchecked because it was inconvenient. What had happened was subtler and in some ways harder to fix. A maintenance culture under chronic pressure to minimize turnaround time had been reading service bulletin language in the most permissive direction available, defaulting to the shorter inspection pathway whenever the language gave them room, not out of carelessness, but because the ambient measurement of success in their operational environment was speed, and thoroughness was only measured when something went wrong. Rhys recognized this. It was the same logic he had documented 11 years ago. Not the same company. Not even the same component, the same underlying pattern, the quiet institutional habit of treating small signals as not worth the cost of slowing down for. Transport Canada Safety Inspector Audrey Flanagan arrived at the gate 40 minutes after Terry's call went up the chain. She reviewed the photographs, the maintenance records, and the service bulletin deviation. She asked Quinn Sherwood a series of precise and unambiguous questions. Then she asked to speak with the passenger who had identified the condition. When she introduced herself to Rhys, he and Nadia were sitting near a window overlooking the apron. Nadia working through a chapter of the novel she'd brought. Audrey did not approach him as an anomaly. She approached him as what he was. A person with directly relevant knowledge whose decision to speak had produced a chain of events a safety investigator could trace clearly and without gaps. She told him she intended to cross-reference the service bulletin deviation with his original continental aerotech analysis. She said that if the deviation pattern was systemic across the maintenance pool, the scope of the review would need to expand. Rhys listened and felt something that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite vindication, and was not exactly peace, but was in the general vicinity of all three. The specific feeling of something that has been true for a long time finally being permitted to exist in the same room as the people who needed to hear it. He said the deviation was almost certainly not isolated, that the operational pressure that produced it was environmental rather than individual, and that any review which addressed only the specific door rather than the culture that had allowed the pattern to persist would produce a finding without a fix. Audrey took notes. She was the kind of person who took notes without being asked, which Rhys recognized as a quality shared by everyone he had ever trusted in this industry. He said, half to himself and half to the room, that aircraft don't develop problems because one person makes one mistake. They develop problems when enough people agree that small signals aren't worth the cost of stopping for. Shannon Weld had been standing near the gate door for the better part of 2 hours. Her post required it. She was present for the maintenance conversation, for the transport inspector's arrival, for the gradual reorganization of the afternoon around a man she had told to stop worrying in front of a full cabin. She heard what Rhys said. She did not look away when he said it. The substitute aircraft was prepared in just under 2.5 hours. Craig, the man from 15C, who had spent the delay on a work call, emerged from it in a different mood than the one he had boarded with. He found Rhys near a charging column with Nadia, asleep against his arm, and introduced himself not as a man with a connecting meeting, but as someone who had been wrong about what the delay meant and wanted to say so clearly. Rhys shook his hand. He didn't say it was fine, because it hadn't been. He said he appreciated the honesty. When Captain Laurier addressed the passengers at the gate before boarding the substitute aircraft, he kept it brief. He said the departure had been delayed because of a maintenance condition identified during boarding, that the condition had been properly evaluated and resolved, and that the delay was the system doing what it was supposed to do. Then he said, and this was not something captains typically said in gate addresses, which was why the people listening sat up slightly, that a passenger had brought the condition to the crew's attention, and that the crew's responsibility at that point had been to listen. He didn't name Rhys. He didn't need to. Before the boarding line formed, Vincent walked to where Rhys was standing with Nadia, now awake and eating an apple from her bag, and extended a hand. He said he had spent the better part of 3 safety seminars using the SEAL analysis as a case study on the relationship between maintenance documentation and institutional resistance. He said that reading a document about a person and watching that same person identify a failure mode from a coach seat were 2 different kinds of education, and that he was grateful for both. Rhys shook his hand. He said the analysis was never the point. The point was the door, and the door was the same today as it had been 11 years ago, and the industry was still deciding whether that was worth pausing for. Vincent nodded. It was the nod of a man who understood exactly what was being said and did not need to improve on it. Shannon found Rhys near the gate door just before boarding. She had spent most of the delay, what the boasted to say, and arrived at the conclusion that whatever she said was going to fall short, which meant the only question was whether falling short was better than saying nothing. She had 6 years in this job and had built, without quite meaning to, a working taxonomy of difficult passengers, the anxious, the entitled, the ones whose difficulty was rooted in fear and the ones whose difficulty was rooted in ego. She had placed Rhys in one of those categories within 30 seconds of their first interaction. The jacket, the child, the slightly too careful way he watched the cabin. She had been wrong. Not about the jacket or the child, those details were accurate. She had been wrong about what they meant, which was nothing. Nothing at all about whether the person behind them carried knowledge worth hearing. She said, "I didn't know who you were." Rhys looked at her for a moment. He said, "You didn't need to know who I was to hear what I was saying." He said it without heat. He said it the way a person states something they have believed for long enough that it no longer requires emotion to hold it up. Shannon was quiet. She had been prepared for an apology transaction. She would offer, he would accept, the ledger would close. What she hadn't prepared for was the sense that the conversation was about something larger than the transaction, that what had happened that afternoon was not fundamentally about Rhys Paxton at all, but about the habit of reading people before listening to them, and the cost of that habit when the reading was wrong and the moment was time-sensitive. She turned to Nadia and apologized to her directly. She hadn't planned to do it, but once she started, it felt like the part of the apology that mattered most, the acknowledgement that a child had watched her father be made small in public and had carried that in her body for 2 hours. Nadia looked at her and said it was okay, in the specific way children say it when they mean something more conditional than the words suggest. Rhys told Shannon that if she wanted to do something useful with the afternoon, the most useful thing wasn't the apology, it was the adjustment. Specifically, building the habit of passing concerns upward rather than closing them at the point of first contact, because the point of first contact was not always where the relevant expertise lived. Shannon said she understood. He said that, what happened the next time, A passenger said something that made her impatient, would be a more honest measure of that understanding than anything she said right now. She absorbed this without flinching, which was something. She said quietly that she would not dismiss something like this again. He said the next one might not wait for her to be ready. Quinn Sherwood met with Rhys in a small conference room adjacent to the operations center. She was accompanied by the carrier's regional safety liaison. She said the carrier was reviewing its maintenance communication protocols, that the service bulletin deviations would be fully documented and reported to the relevant oversight bodies, and that she personally wanted him to know that the manner in which his initial report had been handled in the cabin did not reflect the carrier's stated values. A sentence she had clearly workshopped, which Rhys received with neutral acknowledgement. She asked whether he would be willing to be considered for a consulting role with the carrier's safety advisory panel. Rhys didn't answer immediately. He looked at the conference room window, which gave out onto the apron. Ground crews moved with the deliberate, unhurried precision of people who understood that their work was the physical foundation of other people's safety. He thought about the offer, the way he had trained himself to think about most things. Not with the first response, which was complicated, but with the slower, more honest one. He thought about Nadia, who was outside the conference room with her book and a bag of crackers, who would start grade 5 in 3 weeks, who had asked him 2 nights ago in the hotel whether his job fixing mining equipment was important. He had answered her truthfully, that it was useful and that he was good at it, but that it was not the work he had built himself to do. He said he would consider the role under specific conditions. The first, the carrier's passenger-facing crew needed training not only on the technical characteristics of safety reports, but on the non-discriminatory handling of them. The value of a safety observation was entirely independent of the appearance, profession, or seat class of the person making it, and any training that failed to address that directly was not adequate training. The second, the maintenance deviation findings needed to be shared with the broader maintenance community, not resolved internally and treated as isolated. A systemic problem addressed as an individual incident would simply recur. The third, his original analysis from Continental Aerotech needed to be formally reviewed in the context of the day's findings, not because he required vindication, but because the analysis contained documented findings that were clearly still relevant, and that had been sitting unused for 11 years, while the industry it had tried to protect kept flying. Quinn said all 3 were conditions she could take seriously and pursue formally. He said he would wait for a formal proposal. He said he was not looking to return to the industry to prove something he already knew was true. He was only willing to return if the return produced outcomes that actually helped the people boarding these aircraft trust that the warnings they raised were being heard. He left the conference room, collected Nadia from the chair where she had been working through her crackers and her novel, and they walked toward the gate. The substitute aircraft was slightly newer. Same carrier, warmer overhead lighting. Nadia took the same window seat without hesitation, which Rhys noticed and did not comment on. She looked out at the apron with the composed attention of someone who had decided at some point in the last few hours not to be frightened of this. The light had shifted while they waited. Calgary in late September had a specific quality in the early evening, the sky going wide and cool, the mountains to the southwest catching the last of the color before dark. It was the kind of light that made the city look both temporary and enormous at the same time, which was, Rhys thought, not an inaccurate way to describe it. He settled into his seat and ran a hand along the armrest in the reflexive, habitual way of a person who is always gently taking stock of the physical world around them. Nadia watched him do it. She had watched him do it her whole life. Shannon moved through the cabin for the pre-departure check. When she reached row 14, she paused. she said clearly and without the generic warmth of a job function, "Mr. Paxton." His name. Nadia noticed. Rhys noticed. The woman across the aisle who had been on the original aircraft noticed, and filed it in the category of small corrections that carry within them a disproportionate amount of meaning. The aircraft pushed back, and the engines climbed through their startup sequence. And Nadia reached over and tucked her hand inside her father's elbow the way she had when she was much smaller, and the world was still sorted primarily into frightening and not frightening, and her father had been the main mechanism for moving between the two. The aircraft lifted. Calgary fell away beneath them. The mountains caught the last of the September gold, and the sky above the clouds was deep and clear, and the engines held their cruise pitch with the steadiness of a system running as it was meant to run, maintained by people doing their jobs with the seriousness those jobs required. And the overwing exit door beside Nadia's row held its seal without event, correctly seated, pressure stable, the way it was always supposed to be. In the weeks that followed, the carrier completed an expanded inspection of 11 aircraft, sharing the maintenance pool of the original plane. 2 additional overwing exits were identified as requiring gasket replacement. The service bulletin deviation was fully documented and reported to Transport Canada. Audrey Flanagan's office cross-referenced Rhys's Continental Aerotech analysis and submitted a formal citation of the document to the Canadian Aviation Safety Board's Technical Reference Registry, reclassifying it from informal submission to reference technical finding. It was a small administrative change. Rhys read the notification on a Thursday morning at his workbench in Airdrie while a conveyor motor waited for his attention. He read it twice. He set the phone face down on the bench and went back to the motor. The formal consulting proposal arrived from Quinn Sherwood's office 4 weeks after the Calgary flight. Rhys read it at the kitchen table after Nadia had gone to bed. It included all 3 conditions he had set, translated into the careful formal language of employment agreements. The kind of language that could be revisited later by people with sufficient lawyers and sufficient motivation, but that had for now the shape of a commitment. When Nadia came home from school the following afternoon, he told her he was thinking about going back to a version of the work he had done before. She thought about this for a moment and then said, "Like what happened at the airport?" He said something like that. She nodded with the considered seriousness of a 10-year-old who had recently added a significant data point to her understanding of who her father was and was still in the process of integrating what that meant. Then she went to get a snack. He accepted the consulting role on a part-time basis, structured around Nadia's school schedule, with the 3 conditions written formally into the engagement terms. He did not accept it to be vindicated. He did not accept it to be known. He accepted it because there was a version of the industry that could be made less likely to do what it had done that September evening at Calgary International. Less likely to arrange conditions under which a flight attendant's working assumptions about passengers, a maintenance crew's operational pace, and a service bulletin's ambiguous language could all converge in the same afternoon and nearly produce an outcome that no one wanted. And if the path to that version ran through his particular knowledge and his willingness to walk back into rooms that had once been organized to exclude him, then that was the work. That was, he supposed, what the work had always been. On career day at Nadia's school, she stood at the front of her classroom with the quiet gravity of a child who had thought carefully about what she wanted to say. She introduced her father not as the mechanic who fixed mining equipment, and not as the man who used to work in aviation, but as the man who looked at a door on an aircraft and decided that what he saw was worth saying out loud, even when everyone around him had decided it wasn't. Rhys sat in the back of the classroom in a chair scaled for someone a third of his size and listened to his daughter describe him and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was simply the absence of weight. the particular lightness of a person who has been carrying something quietly for years, and has finally been seen carrying it, clearly and without distortion, by the person whose seeing matters most. That evening, after school, Nadia got her notebook out at the kitchen table and wrote something down. She did not show it to him. He did not ask. Later, after she was asleep, he found the notebook exactly where she had left it, open on the table. He didn't read it on purpose. The words were just there. My dad sees things before they become problems. That's his job, even when it isn't his job. He closed the notebook carefully and left it where she had left it. He made himself a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window for a long while, looking out at the airdrie night, the wide flat dark of the Alberta sky, and the lights of Calgary glowing to the south. And he thought about the door on the aircraft, and the gap that was nearly nothing, and the fact that nearly nothing was still something, and that on one ordinary Thursday in September, when his daughter was trying to be brave about flying, and a cabin full of strangers had decided he didn't know what he was looking at, someone had finally listened.